Welcome to the Bearhug Experience, where we cozy up to the fire in our digital den and immerse ourselves in the inspiration born from exploring the hidden narratives and inevitable plot twists that shape every compelling startup journey. Join us as we showcase inspirational guests from bold investors with the Midas touch to pioneering entrepreneurs at the helm of today's most thrilling startups. We'll also hear from courageous go-to-market leaders navigating the frontier of emerging tech and the unsung heroes bringing all the people and parts together to form unstoppable dream teams. Here's your host, Kraig Ward, founder and managing director of Bearhug Recruiting. Get ready for an insightful journey.
The following is a conversation with Jennifer Gill Roberts, co-founder and managing partner of Grit Ventures. Jennifer is a technologist, a repeat entrepreneur, and a dedicated advocate for diversity. She is also an early-stage venture capitalist. Jennifer specializes in sourcing and investing in groundbreaking sustainable technology innovations from the nation's top labs. These innovations tackle real-world challenges, from rebuilding our physical infrastructure to accelerating manufacturing and incorporating AI-powered robotic applications across industries like construction, agriculture, and logistics. Welcome to the Bearhug Experience. And now, dear friends, fellow entrepreneurs, investors, and startup enthusiasts, here is Jennifer Gill Roberts. All right, Jennifer, how are you?
Kraig, I'm good, thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you doing this.
I am thrilled to be here.
Well, how are you feeling coming into this? I don't know if you do a lot of these types of interviews, but what's your state coming in?
I find myself on panels quite a bit. I moderate or I'm a speaker. I've done a lot of speaking in classes at universities. But that's a little bit different than being the subject of a podcast. So it's been a while.
Well, I understand that you're on a mission of sorts. So why don't you tell our listeners what you're up to these days and why it matters?
So I've spent my entire career in venture and entrepreneurship, but right now I have the privilege of managing my own fund. It's called Grit Ventures, and we're sourcing deep technology innovation out of the nation's top labs, which is really where all of this innovation is happening. It's funded by non-dilutive grants and corporate research, but getting it out of the labs is actually very tough. But we need it. We need it for, the world's biggest problems. So we focus, for example, on automation, logistics, sustainability, and more importantly, we're focusing on diverse teams. These big problems need diverse minds and experiences to solve them. So
automation, sustainability, logistics.
Breaking that down a little bit, it's things like robotics applied to older industries like manufacturing, construction, agriculture, physical infrastructure, real world problems.
Yeah, no, that's why I wanted you to come on the show, because I find those to be some of the most interesting problems to solve, because there's so much to be done there from a technology perspective.
No, I think so too.
So what have you learned about yourself that makes you so perfectly suited to take on this type of investment strategy? Like what superpowers do you possess that are really driving this thing?
So I think a couple. One is I'm insatiably curious. And I remember, as a kid, always wanting to understand how things work, but not, taking apart a piece of hardware. It was more, how does the world work? Which is why I love this kind of the scope of physical infrastructure and industries and the impact of weather and kind of all the ecosystems. So just crazy curious, also about people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also very decisive, some might say impulsive at times, but it has enabled me to make decisions. And a lot of early stage, whether you're a founder or an investor, is about being able to take ideas and scope and the whole plate of things, but make decisions. Where are you going to focus? And then the third is I have a lot of energy, which is, again, good and bad. Your greatest strengths are also your weaknesses.
Yep.
like to be in motion. I like to be very productive, and it kind of fuels all that work, if you will.
Well, and so that kind of leads into talking naturally about the flip side of that, right? So what are the things that you find that kind of wear you down or suck your energy while you're on this path with this ambitious strategy to help the world?
Yeah, I think number one is negative thinking. Um, it just drives me crazy. And I mean, I'm an optimist, and I know that sometimes, I look at too rosy a picture, but negative thinking just kind of saps my energy. I also just, at this point in my life and career, I really don't want to work with jerks. So people who, mistreat other people, who are disrespectful, who don't listen, who are self-absorbed, like all those traits are just really difficult for me. And I just try to, not work with those people. And I also don't like working alone. I'm a very collaborative person, and it's hard. A VC typically, even in a bigger partnership, you do work alone. So I try to address that by, using a lot of people as sounding boards, other VCs or academics or entrepreneurs, by helping people, whether it's diligence on a deal that's not my own, or, just trying to create a world in which I'm, collaborating with other folks, even if I have to make decisions on my own.
Well, Jennifer, why don't we give our listeners a window into where you come from? So, just for fun, the way that I like to do this is going to ask you to tell me your entire life story from the moment that you were born up until today with an imposed 5-minute time cap. Now, I do this during my first call with every candidate that I try and recruit for my clients, and I'm always so amused at what people choose to share and how they manage the sort of healthy self-induced stress from this time cap. So, can you take a quick look at the time and hold yourself to sharing with us your life story over the next 5 minutes?
Okay, I'll try.
All right.
So I grew up in Berkeley in the 70s. I was raised by a single mom. She was a teacher and community organizer. And I had a father who lived in Silicon Valley, who was a scientist, entrepreneur, and later a VC. So you can imagine that kind of contrast. It was also, a time of civil rights, which really impacted me, but also the rise of all this technology in Silicon Valley. In fact, my father was the first person who told me that the Silicon Valley area, that's what it was called. And I was like, what are you talking about? So I grew up going to the Lawrence Hall of Science and, getting exposed to everything from entomology and coding to a robot that talked to you, which is crazy to think about in the 70s.
Hmm.
And so I had that kind of contrast. Of course, I think my dad won out in terms of influencing me to, pursue a technical degree and go into technology, but it was also, kind of what I enjoyed. So I did my undergrad at Stanford and my master's at UT Austin in electrical engineering. And I got to really see firsthand the whole wave of computers, right? So, like one of the Mac designers at Apple, who was like employee number 10, came into one of my Stanford classes and brought like, one of the first Macs. And, I bought a compact luggable, if you will, as a first PC. But I could see like, okay, this is going to shrink. Hardware is
Mm-hmm.
really exciting. We were using networks on campus. And then when I went to Sun Microsystems, I saw everything in the labs that was eventually going to play out. We were going to have video streaming on a PC, which was crazy. We were going to have networks that transcended, geography, the, wide area networks. And so it was kind of exciting to be in Silicon Valley and to have that all kind of unfold in front of you, and then to know, where you might go with it. So after business school, when I went into venture, I wanted to fund the telecom wave. I knew that, we needed more bandwidth, that there were, computers that were hungry for it. And so I spent a decade at Seven Rosen Funds, funding super early stage, like optical and wireless companies. And we had tremendous success. A lot of companies went public and sold a lot to companies you may not even remember, like the Nortels of the world. But we also got, excuse me, a glimpse into what the applications were going to be. I remember seeing the Yahoo guys at a booth at a conference, just the two of them when they got started. The Google guys were in the office next door to mine, and my partner actually didn't think they were worth funding. um, so, of course, VCs do make mistakes. But that's the privilege of being here, right? Is that you have some of the brightest minds. You have this critical mass of research dollars, universities. So I saw the mobile revolution coming before the Apple App Store. And then before I launched Grit, I could see that, this was the time for the robotic revolution
Mm.
and for infrastructure. And so I feel lucky. I feel very privileged to have grown up here in the Bay Area.
So you did a little stint in Austin for school, but then you came back.
I did. My parents are from Texas, and Texas has kind of been a theme throughout my career. So I did my graduate degree there, and I thought maybe I'd want to live in Austin.
Hmm.
It was at the time there was a lot of semiconductor companies there, but it really wasn't as exciting as Silicon Valley. It's come a long ways. But Seven Rosen was headquartered in Dallas. I helped build out the California office, and a lot of my telecom companies were in Texas. So it's kind of been a place that I've continued to go to, and I have family there, and I'm really committed to seeing the transition, if you will, from an oil and gas economy to an innovation economy in Texas. I think that's going to be a critical factor for the U.S. overall.
Well, Austin's just blown up too. I've watched it over the last decade or more, and it's crazy the growth there. I mean, with Elon going over there with his team for SpaceX and everything else, Austin itself just is blown up too. Wild.
I love Austin. I mean, it's, keep Austin weird is the
Uh-huh.
motto.
Yeah.
It's an amazing town with not only university and state government, but also music and art. And I mean, it's really amazing. I do think it's funny, though, that having spent most of my summers in Texas, my mom was a teacher, so we would
Uh-huh.
we would just go stay with her family in the summers. I know how hot it is, but all these Californians moved down there, and after like a summer or two, they're like, "Wait, whoa, time out! Like 100 days of 105 degrees, like I'm out." So I think we'll continue to see an influx there, but it can be challenging weather.
Yeah. Wow. So mom was a single mom and a teacher, and dad was a scientist and later turned VC. So there were obviously some, early influences from both of them early on. I'm fascinated by psychologists writing so much about how much of our character is formed by the age of 7. Um, and I've got 2 kids.
Yeah, I believe that too, by the way.
Yeah. So I analyze this a lot, just having children of my own. But who or what can you point to during those formative years that, really impacted your character that you have today?
Well, I'm going to go with both parents, which seems kind of obvious, but both of my parents are incredibly high energy, indefatigable people. Like they are still working, they're in their 80s.
Ah,
My mom's still a community organizer and doing a bunch of other things. She lives up in Santa Rosa. My dad's still busy and active as an investor and, kind of leader in venture and entrepreneurship. He lives in Texas. And I think it's funny because I asked my son, what he thought the values of our family were at one
mm-hmm.
point. And he's like, well, Mom, the chief principle, and I'm like, why are you even calling it that? Is work hard. And I think that actually was the chief principle for me growing up. I think both parents impressed upon me, how hard you need to work,
Mm-hmm.
not just to make the good grades, but to learn, to help others, to be part of the community. I mean, just in every aspect of your life, it's like put in that time and hard work.
Well, it sounds like this being in motion, and being an optimist, and you talked about being very, very decisive and having this insatiable curiosity. You kind of had a balance of both of those from both the hardworking mentality that both your parents had.
Yeah, and they're so different, by the way. I mean, my mom's like probably the most intuitive person I know, so a people person.
Uh-huh.
And my dad's very cerebral and technical. He was a PhD scientist before he became a venture person, and he still reads, technical publications. And anyway, so different. So I am grateful to have, a combination of those two things.
Well, that was interesting because I remember when you were talking about superpowers, you threw in there at the end, you're like, I was deeply interested and curious how the world worked, which kind of alludes to your dad's influence. And then you're like, and people. It was like this piece that
Yeah,
your mom came into it too, it sounds like.
For sure. I
And
mean,
then,
it's both, right?
well, and then you talked about how your dad ultimately kind of won out. It sounds like in regards to the direction that you went with schooling. So his influence made an impact on what you actually ended up studying.
Yeah, I remember when I was applying to Stanford was when he was launching his venture fund, and you had to put your parents' occupation down. And I'm like, can you explain what you do, Dad? That was his first year.
Uh-huh.
But, all throughout college, he exposed me to entrepreneurs. I remember hating it. He'd be like, hey, hun, we're going to have breakfast with this CEO, which is not something a college undergrad wants to do.
Ah,
um, but it kind of, I learned the whole venture process. I watched it, as an undergrad, even before I decided to work in the field. And I met the types of people who were founders and who took risk. And I also learned to not be overly impressed with people. I mean, I met
mm,
so many important people throughout my career, and I don't have the, kind of hero worship for anybody. I think everybody's human and flawed. And um, I don't know, that served me well. It allowed me to be comfortable in a very, I think of it as a very elite world. Maybe it shouldn't be, right? But it is.
I find that fascinating because so many people, yeah, they're awestruck, right, when they meet these people that have done all these things. But I guess was it just because you were exposed to so many different types of people that kind of created that not being impressed mentality?
I think so, and I hope that doesn't come off the wrong way. Important academics too, and I mean, I had tremendous respect. I mean, I have a reverence for people who are just like supremely competent at something.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, was probably my parents' other motto was like, be competent in all situations. But I didn't necessarily think that they were better than other people.
Mm.
Like there are just circumstances that enabled them to get to that point in their career or field that not everybody else got. I don't know. I'm not sure where that came from. I think
Yeah.
it's a humility, some kind of humility from my parents.
Well, and probably just having that intuition maybe that was influenced by your mom too, where you could see that there's more behind the scenes going on than just looking at things on a at face value. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
like I
no,
said.
definitely.
Well, when you think about sort of I mean, I really want to paint a picture for people of some of the, pivot points and turning points in a person's life, especially as they're coming into their professional stages, like post college. Um,
Hmm.
what can you remember kind of in this figuring it out stage? Maybe it was in school or after school when you actually hit some points of adversity. Because I know it's not always a straight line and it's not always a smooth path. There are moments where people are going to stumble, they're going to trip and fall, and they've got to work through some big issues. What can you pinpoint were big developmental phases that were an occurrence of a like a one or two big moments early in your life, whether it's pre-college, college, post-college, somewhere in there?
Um, well, one is I transferred to Stanford from MIT, and MIT was a very tough place. When I was there in the 80s, there was no plus or minus for your grade. Your grade was pretty much your final.
Hmm.
It was pretty brutal, right? I was sort of that hard worker, as I mentioned, and I was used to doing all the problem sets and quizzes and tests and sort of having it all average out and make a good grade. And in one of my first electrical engineering courses at MIT, I, went into the final with like an A, but I got a C on the final and got a C plus or something. And I remember sitting on the bridge in the snow and crying, wondering like, can I do this? I had already applied to transfer to Stanford at that point because I found the culture at MIT was very tough.
Hmm.
And I had gotten in, but I definitely questioned like, am I up for this? And I think for so many people in whatever academic pursuit they have moments like that. And I don't know, maybe it's just tenacity, but it's just realizing that probably everybody has setbacks and don't give up. Like power through or get the support you need. I mean, I would go to office hours for my professors. I would do problem sets with my classmates. I mean, I wasn't the smartest in my classes, but I was smart enough and I was willing to work hard. And I could see, that this was going to lead somewhere with real interesting career opportunities. And then I experienced that in work too, right? I mean, when I first joined Sun Microsystems, I used to leave work at like, I don't know, 7 o'clock or something, which I thought was a long day. And then at one point, my manager told me, like, you know what, Jennifer, you're not working hard enough. We all stay in the lab until, we were bringing up a workstation, until like midnight, and we really expect more of you. And again, it was one of those go home and cry moments. um, but you have to, at least think about, well, okay, so can I step up to the expectations of this particular work environment? Or can I change anything about this work environment? So that just kind of those kind of challenges, I think, come up frequently. I experienced them in my first venture fund, in the startup that I founded. Some amount of perseverance, learning to get you through those hard spots.
Well, and I'm curious, this electrical engineering degree that you decided to land on, what was that about? I mean, out of all the things you could have done, how did you kind of land there? Was it just a natural inclination you had?
Uh, well, Dad told me that was the degree to get. No,
Uh,
it was also, my husband makes fun of me because I used to have this when I was an undergrad, this like ranking of what were the most difficult majors, and physics was at the top. But I wasn't really an abstract thinker that way. And then the next was electrical engineering, and then mechanical or whatever. And so he'll tell people this to embarrass me because I don't believe in this now. But I wanted to pursue the hardest major in engineering. I like the fact that it was, you were building something physical.
uh-huh.
I mean, I guess mechanical would have satisfied that, but not chemical, right?
Right.
Um, I don't know. It was not, it was somewhat, capricious, if you will.
Right.
But so senior year, when we started actually, doing stuff that was digital, not analog, that was when I thought, oh my God, this is fascinating, like computer architecture.
Hmm.
So I ended up doing my master's with a focus on computer architecture.
Well, and then you added business on top of that. Was that also an influence of your father, or was that a professor, or what led to that?
Yeah, several things. I mean, he did tell me an MBA would be useful. By the way, he doesn't have one, so maybe that's why.
Yeah.
um, but I had a master's, right? And I thought that I was going to progress up the technical chain of, get to VP engineering and CEO. CEO was the goal.
Uh-huh.
Um, and then I realized, I think when I was at Sun, as I mentioned earlier, that I was a good manager. I was a good, I could synthesize things. I wasn't necessarily going to be the brilliant innovator or inventor. And that made me start to think about what was the value of the MBA,
Hmm.
in terms of getting to CEO. I wasn't thinking about venture then. But honestly, I could not get into Stanford Business School today, I'm sure. But it was such a special place for helping you to make a transition, right? So I transitioned from computers to networking, and from engineering to venture. And, but it was a 2-year period it was a luxurious period of getting exposed to things and learning, and doing projects for companies. And, so it was really just a privilege to be there, to have, to create a career transition.
Well, so you've seen these major tech cycles, right? You've seen the internet, you've seen the social, you've seen the mobile, you've seen the cloud. We're seeing the Web3, right? Like these are like major things that you've been able to see from the very, very beginning stages when the first Mac was brought into your school, and you're like, this is going to shrink, right?
Yeah,
That's amazing.
definitely.
And so the it's
Well, and
on
that's the privilege of being in Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah, so the mobile, it sounds like the kind of optical wireless sort of telecom wave, going into mobile and robotics. Those things were just kind of natural layers of unfolding as you were having the experiences that you had primarily in venture right out of school.
So the mobile social gaming wave, in my mind, started in the early 2000s.
Hmm.
And I tried to actually launch a venture fund to focus on mobile applications before the App Store. So that was maybe a bit too early. And that's been one of my big lessons, is I've tended to be a bit early.
Hmm.
So I'm trying now as an investor not to be. But we did fund some interesting companies that were kind of the infrastructure of mobile. So, for example, when someone calls you and it shows their phone number, you want to know what city. they're calling from, that was an application that we
Hmm.
funded. But of course, things exploded with the App Store and became very consumer centric, and that did not excite me at all. The digital application consumer side. So when I launched Grit in around 2017, and I'd looked at hardware like wearables and things like that before that, I was so excited that the timing was right for another infrastructure wave, right? That the cost of hardware had come down, largely based on the volume of mobile phones and auto. And also, the AI had progressed, the data sets, new business models like robotics as a service. So it was like, wow, we're now entering a new wave of deep tech, which
Hmm.
is just super exciting.
Well, and so the fund that you were a part of for 7 years, what was what were sort of the main learnings for you during that window? I mean, it sounds like you've gone through some of that now, but in terms of you deciding to branch out on your own to form Grit, I think you said 2017.
hmm You mean like what did I learn at Seven Rosen Funds about venture?
Yeah, I guess, did you always know that you were going to be on your own?
Well, I didn't aspire to be on my own, right? I mean, I have a venture partner right now. I have a partner who kind of spun out to focus on platform stuff,
Hmm.
um, and then I have some potential partners to join in 2024. So the goal is not to be a sole GP.
Yeah.
I think a really great model for super early stage venture is, 3 to 4 partners. Maybe it's $100 million fund if you're doing pre-seed. Obviously, you need to scale it if you're doing seed or A.
Hmm.
But where you do, 2 to 3 deals per partner per year, you really get very involved. I mean, that's the model I learned when I was at Seven Rosen Funds. It's just that firm scaled, and we had practice areas, which were sort of like an emerging manager.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I definitely want to work with other people. I don't want to be part of a firm that has 100 people.
Yeah.
A platform team and 5 different practice areas and 3 country funds and I call those empires.
Hmm.
And a lot of them are very successful. It's just not where I want to play. I really like that kind of super early stage. 3 people, 2 founders, coming out of the labs, that really kind of messy, creative, chaotic part of, company formation.
Oh man, I got so many questions to understand that a little bit more. I want to go there in just a second, where like we can talk more about the lab. But when it comes to when you stepped out to form your first venture fund and you were trying to raise your first fund, what was that
hmm
process like? Can you kind of walk us through just high level what those steps and stages looked like and the pressures that you were under? And um, I don't know. I just wanted to get a window into that.
Yeah, and it's changed so dramatically. So like Seven Rosen Funds had probably 400 LPs across 9 funds.
Okay.
And so when we had an annual meeting, it was like 500 people, and we had 30 or 40 university endowments and foundations, and kind of what you would think of now as elite institutional LPs. And in the early 2000s, the funds that went out then, that's who they had to go after, right? So they were spinning out of bigger funds, and then they were raising from that same set of LPs. Tons of diligence, very intensive process. I think we were trying to raise 100 and we got to 30, and so we didn't close it. But today, as an emerging manager, it's completely different, right? So when I went out to raise Grit Fund One, it was family offices and high net worth individuals. You're not going to close an institutional investor in a fund one, with a few exceptions, but very few. And so today it's really, a huge universe of family offices and high net worth individuals that are funding all these emerging managers.
And so these people that are putting money into your fund, it sounds like it'd be
hmm
hard to kind of pattern match across the different family offices but these people are basically looking to deploy capital as part of a diversification strategy, right? And so a portion of what they want to deploy would go to a firm with a thesis that you particularly have that aligns with their interests. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, theoretically. No, I mean, I think that family offices really are range, right? It could be 2 people or a
Hmm.
100 people. It could be multi-generational. Some of them want to invest in domains that they know well.
Hmm.
So if they made money in some manufacturing business and they see the need for automation, they might be attracted to that, or whatever business they were in. So, like they're just, it isn't one size fits all. And so it's just a journey of meeting hundreds. um, One emerging manager I know said that she met like 300 family offices in 6 months. I certainly never achieved that level,
Oh my lord.
but it's really just establishing trust and rapport, right? I think that's number one.
Hmm.
That chemistry. Do they think that your particular sector is going to drive outsized returns? How much exposure do they have already? Um, Again, validation. Someone they know telling them that you're going to make money in this sector.
Hmm.
It's not a kind of logical kind of known path. It's a little bit of a random walk and a lot of hustle.
But with raising your first fund, right, not having that track record, were you leveraging obviously the storylines that you could pull from the 7 years you did prior? And was that a big help, or was it still as if you were starting from scratch?
It was a little bit like starting from scratch. People discounted a track record that was, 7 years old or really 10 years old.
Hmm.
I had done a startup in between. I did launch a syndicate on Angel List, and I made investments, and I served as an interim executive in a couple startups. And I began, mentoring startups through like Stanford StartX. And I just kind of
Mm.
pieced together facets of a track record. But equally important are things like sourcing, your portfolio model. I think people, did like the fact that I was an experienced VC who had done hardware, right?
Hmm.
Because honestly, there were very few people back in 2015 to 17 funding robotics. I could count on one hand, because the hardware VCs from the telecom era, kind of the 90s and early 2000s, all kind of remade themselves. Either they, moved up in their empire, to manage the NEAs and Greylocks and Lightspeeds and KPs and Sequoias of the world, or they reposition themselves into things like enterprise SaaS security. Um, so there really weren't a lot of hardware focused VCs back in 2015.
Well, and you also during that time, I don't know if it was 2015, but the whole clean tech kind of rise and fall. Remember that whole flow?
Yeah.
were,
Oh yeah. Oh
were,
yeah.
were you part of that at all?
No, I wasn't. I didn't have an energy background. And that happens in every sector, right? Like kind of the too early phase.
Yeah.
um, my partner was in private equity at the time, funding a lot of the climate tech that the VCs had abandoned. But I'm excited that, kind of now is the time for climate tech and sustainability, right? And there were a lot of lessons learned from that period.
Okay. So going back to this sort of fundraising process with LPs, so you convince a number of these family offices and so forth to invest in you. So you have a fund, and you're at that point a solo manager to start out, and you start to go look for deals. Or I guess you already had pipeline, I'm assuming, but walk us through the process of like what does it look like to secure the funding and then start building the pipeline, starting to talk to these founders and narrow down the diligence process to start making, what is it, two or three, four investments a year, and check size. Can you kind of walk us through that whole flow?
Yeah, no, and I invested personal money in several startups. So I warehouse some, right?
Hmm.
Because investors really want to see exactly what you're going to fund and exactly what your sourcing engine is. But yeah, the model was, and still is, 2 to 3 investments per year. Conviction portfolio models mean, you have fewer companies in your portfolio and you're spending more time on them, and hopefully you own more of them.
Hmm.
So if you're leading a pre-seed round, you're writing a check for 500K out of a million, or maybe 750K out of 1.5 million. Um, you're taking a board seat, which not a lot of early stage investors do. and really helping them commercialize. But these were not companies that were like concepts.
Right.
They were companies coming out of the labs that had a working prototype. They'd done customer discovery, they had a pilot lined up. Some had gone through millions and millions of money, in non-dilutive grants. So it was really just, how do you now go to market? How do you execute a pilot? What should the business model be? What's the go-to-market strategy? Who should I hire? That's that fun, messy part I was telling you about earlier.
Yeah, for both of us. I love that. I love that stage. Can you give us an example? I don't know. I think a story would really help it land. Maybe that you've gone into a university setting and seen some of these prototypes. Uh, can you tell us kind of a storyline of an exciting one that you've been a part of, just to give us a window into that process?
Yeah, so I can tell you about a couple of Fund One companies. One is a company called Canvas, which is in the construction robotic space. They do autonomous drywalling, and they had gone through maybe 5 million in grants to deeply technical people out of MIT. And they'd explored different use cases, right? So they before they landed on drywalling. And it's interesting because a lot of the use cases they explored, ended up getting pursued by other, teams and other settings. So it was kind of greenfield back then for robotics, right? The things that you could go after. But drywalling is something that's very backbreaking. There's a shortage of construction workers and notably drywallers, particularly in the Bay Area. And so it seemed like a very, ripe area to go after. But for all these companies, they had the prototype. But when I think about how far that prototype has come, many generations of hardware later, they're really starting to scale now. Also funded a company called Diligent Robotics, which came out of UT Austin, with 3 women founders, which is really cool.
Hmm.
And they do hospital supply deliveries. And they had a prototype. It was very expensive. That's another challenge you have, is you've sort of cobbled together the hardware. Maybe you purchase the base that it rolls on, or you purchase the robotic arm, or and it's really expensive. So you're just focused on functionality. But anyway, they're doing it incredibly well. Sadly, we have a lot of turnover and burnout in healthcare workers. So there's a tremendous need for support. There's so many. We've spun companies out of Carnegie Mellon, MIT, Stanford, UT, really just innovation across the country.
And so you've just built these relationships. Like, you obviously have to meet a lot of people and nurture those relationships with these sort of sources that can bring deals your way. And then I'm curious, how do you compete? I mean, I'm assuming these places have a lot of different options for where to get funding. And I guess it depends on the climate for fundraising. But in terms of winning deals, is it a matter of being in early and having just a stronger relationship? Is it anything specific and unique that you can bring to the table from a domain expertise perspective? What have you learned in that sort of pitch process for either, I don't know, are they selling to you? Are you selling to them? Or is it mutually a two-way street?
I think it's a two-way street, right? Well, first of all, I don't think pre-seed is that competitive in deep tech, because it's
Hmm.
hard, and not all these companies are, in Silicon Valley, and so they're often in cities where there's less early stage funding. There might be incubators or angels, but they don't have, the wealth of investors that Silicon Valley has. So, they do struggle. A lot of them get government grants even after they're out of the labs, like SBIR grants, or they try to get customer funding, or, non-recurring engineering, or, they just have to be scrappy.
Hmm.
I think that, they do want value-added investors, right? So they do look for, these emerging managers typically who have a very singular focus, like robotics, space software and dual use,
Hmm.
or climate tech, or whatever. So there are kind of focused funds. If we're investing, let's say in Pittsburgh or Austin, we want a co-investor. We want as many, smart people around the table, if you will, to help nurture the companies. So it's usually more collaborative than competitive. It's usually more about how can I get, all these VCs in my network interested in this company?
Mm.
Or, are there value added individuals? There's lots of, retired entrepreneurs, CEOs, retired VCs, et cetera, who are individual investors. I mean, seed and A are obviously more competitive, and having a repeat entrepreneur can make it very competitive.
Hmm.
But, typically a pre-seed first-time founder is not super competitive.
And so most of the check sizes for the types of applications you're investing in, it's sort of in the 500,000 to 750,000. Is that kind of an average check?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess we've gone lower than that, either because the syndicate's bigger, or because they didn't need as much, based on, grant money or customer money or, I mean, it certainly went up. The size of rounds went up pretty dramatically over the last few years, and then they kind of came back down to earth. This year
Hmm.
was a very tough year for startups across all sectors to fundraise. So round sizes came down and valuations came down. These things sort of have cycles to them.
Well, I wonder when a group of really smart founders are building something, and then you compare sort of like this hardware, deep tech world, to like the SaaS world where it's just software, and you ask yourself, well, why don't these companies bootstrap? Well, the capex, the capital investment required for the something that has physical materials associated with it and has production lines and manufacturing, and supply chains and all these different things that software doesn't have. I guess I'm curious, just the differences that you've seen between, like, a company trying to take something and commercialize it out of a lab as opposed to what the VCs that focus more on just pure software SaaS plays. I mean, it's harder, right? What you do.
It's harder, but maybe not for the reasons people think. You know, the capital requirements, if you look across verticals, is actually pretty comparable. Enterprise SaaS companies go through a lot of capital. They just spend it on different things. But the challenges are usually like that you're working, for example, in these older industry verticals, right? So they might have like a long sales cycle,
Hmm.
selling to an old factory or a construction general contractor, or, it's very different than a technical enterprise selling to another technical enterprise. So that's one challenge. I think supply chain is a challenge, right? So if you're building something, and we experienced this particularly during COVID and when our supply chains were broken, and even today, critical components can be hard to get, especially in low volume. So I think that definitely gives me pause in thinking about, robotics is how it's going to evolve. Ideally, a lot of these companies will become, just an AI platform, if you will, with a hardware partner.
Hmm.
And we have examples of that in our portfolio. So the challenges may not be what you think. I'm not disputing that they aren't hard, but it isn't necessarily more capital intensive.
Huh. That's a surprise. Okay. But a lot of these. So I guess maybe the question I'm wondering is, why would people go with VC money versus other institutional forms of funding?
Yeah. I mean, that balance of power has shifted over time back and forth. There was definitely a period, I don't know, maybe in like 2018 to 21 or whatever, where even through COVID, where um, a lot of entrepreneurs could self fund, especially, if they were repeat entrepreneurs.
Hmm.
Um, they Why suffer the dilution of a non value added VC?
Right.
And there are a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, VCs, including emerging managers, who are passive investors. Anyway, so I think they're not rushing out and saying, "Oh, we want venture money," but I think most of them appreciate that if this is my day job, and I have access to all kinds of, sort of value added resources for them, whether it's customer connections, hiring connections, funding connections, and I'm willing to roll up my sleeves and really, spend time on the company, serve on their board. Like, I think they appreciate that. It's, as we were talking about earlier, it's lonely, right? Being a
Yeah.
founder, being a CEO is a very tough job. And so having a sounding board, and again, it may not be just your board members. It could be, your passive investors or other CEOs, but like however you can get that support and value add is certainly worth some dilution.
Yeah, strategic partnerships and such. Corporate sponsors, things like that are a pretty common thing in your world at a certain point of growth.
Yeah, the corporates are coming earlier and earlier, right? I mean, certainly big companies like Intel have been venture investors forever, right? But pretty much every corporate is now an investor, has a venture arm, an
Yep.
innovation team,
Yep.
or invest off their balance sheet. And some come as early as pre-seed. They're willing to, pilot, provide some kind of technical validation. I feel like I work with as many corporate VCs as I do traditional VCs, just when I think about my network.
Can you talk us through like what a jam-packed week on average kind of looks like for you? Like, I mean, I'm wondering how varied is it, or how much there are patterns? And I'm sure there's cycles throughout the year, or cycles with, um, deploying the money in a fund and having to raise another fund. I mean, I'm sure your work cycles shift a lot, but you're very busy, right? I've gathered that over the years I've known you. And by the way, reflecting back on how we met, you brought up the drywall company. And we actually met through a candidate that worked there
Yes, I
that
remember.
introduced us. So I
Yeah.
thought that was fun that you used that as an example. But you're busy, right? So you're doing a lot of different things. Just to give our listeners a way to categorically kind of understand how a person in your world spends their time in an average week at work. Can you think of it sort of in categories, or like certain percentages throughout a
Yeah,
week?
sure. But I don't want to suggest that the way I spend my week is the way every early stage VC spends their
Yeah,
week,
I'm
right?
just more curious. Yeah, what does that breakdown look
Yeah,
like?
I'm more resource constrained, right? I mean, I'm not part of a bigger partnership where there's a team of people, kind of supporting everything I do, right?
Hmm.
So some of it's the mundane. um, but I would say I spend a lot of time sourcing and listening to pitches. And some of that is knowing that they're not on thesis for Grit. So you may say, well, why are you doing that?
Hmm.
So Xiaoming Yin at Lockheed Ventures and I run something called Office Hours, and we have a monthly session on all these topics, how to go from labs to launch. And so we're building a deep tech community of these really early stage founders, and they cross, advanced materials, sustainability, climate tech, robotics, all kinds of fields. And, we're committed to spending some of our time, listening to their pitches, inviting them to join that community, connecting them to resources. And, the payback is really in the sourcing, right? So they tell their friends, Grit's forming this amazing deep tech community, or, Jennifer was very helpful.
Hmm.
So anyway, a lot of that is, not going to factor into the deals I actually do. I spend a lot of time, I'm going to call it networking. So, at the beginning of this year, I thought, wow, I have a really great VC network, hundreds and hundreds of VCs, all
Hmm.
organized in my CRM by stage and sector. And I'm a connector. I love meeting them all. But then it was such a tough fundraising year for our portfolio and everybody's, that I really had to meet, 100 new people. Um, so I'm constantly looking for who's funding deep tech at all the different stages, from my pre-seed syndicates all the way up to my companies that are raising a Series C round, like who's going to help them scale.
Mm.
And so Zoom meetings primarily, but I sometimes try to meet people in person for a coffee, of like new people, just constant.
Mm.
And then a lot of time on my portfolios, right? Whether it's a working session or a board meeting, and it feels like it's more working sessions and calls with CEOs and such than board meetings, to really be hands-on and helpful to them. And then fundraising, like we're wrapping up fund two, and it's pitching myself, right, or working on diligence materials, or and then I don't think I mentioned yet that we have this organization called Grit Labs, So that's our platform. But I have an academic council, so I run those meetings quarterly. We have industry advisors. We put on events. We've worked with corporates. Um, so, kind of the meeting planning
Hmm.
is another part of my week. And I know that all sounds like a lot.
It sounds like an
And
insane a lot. A lot. Yeah.
yeah, the good news is it's fun, right? Like early stage is just really fun. I'm not dealing with kind of administrative issues of a really big fund or so there's some benefit of having all that on my plate.
So when companies get to a point where they've raised a seed, are you less involved, or do you stay involved all the way through as long as they want your participation?
Yeah, more the latter. I originally thought that the model was exit at Series A because that's usually when somebody comes in with a big check. It's a 10 to $20 million round, and they reconfigure the board. And in some of those situations, I've stayed on, and in others, I've exited. And probably I need to be more disciplined about getting off because I need my time back
Hmm.
to work with the really early stage companies. But when you lead like a pre-seed round or seed round, you're usually the first person the CEO calls, and the person who really helps them herd cats into financing or whatever the situation is. And so they don't usually want you to exit the board. You've established a lot of trust, and um, I don't know. Board structures is probably like a whole nother 2 hours of your podcast, and you could have a bunch of different opinions on it. And I think boards can be very constructive. They can also be, harmful to a company when they're not functioning well.
Yeah, I'm in conversation right now with the CEO I'm working with who is having some significant issues getting his budget approved by the new lead investor, and it's delaying our project. So um, I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly from a distance on in
Yeah,
my role
I
too.
bet.
So I want to circle back on superpowers as it relates to portfolio support, because it sounds like you spend a lot of time doing these working sessions, and you're networking and meeting a lot of people and doing so many different things, Grit Labs and on and on and on. But when you think about this sort of intimate time that you get to spend building these deep relationships based on your background and your expertise, and you look at the impact you're having day to day, week to week on these people's lives holistically, right? It's not just a you're taking a holistic approach to who these people are, not just a narrow, single focused problem, one problem at a time type of situation. Is that right? And I'm curious, basically,
Definitely.
the question's more around what are you seeing in terms of the patterns around the impact that you and your particular perspective on life, your perspective on business, what are some of the patterns that are consistent with the people that you're supporting that bring them back to you, that they say, Jennifer, you consistently are the one I come to for this, this, and this, because it makes me feel this way. I get this particular result every time. What are you seeing with your superpowers as it relates to those types of exchanges?
Well, there's what I hope they're experiencing, right? I think being a people person, being a connector, I'm very empathetic. Um, and so I think I make it safe for them to tell me what their problems are, or to not be, have solutions for everything. um, I think they feel comfortable and relaxed when they come to me, and I think they expect that I'm going to be super helpful. That I'm going to be resourceful, creative. Offer solutions. My kid's nickname for me is the Fixer,
Hmm.
which sounds nefarious, but it's really more. I love a good problem to solve, and I expect there to be problems. So anyway, I hope that my CEOs feel that way. I'm also one who likes to kind of dig in. So it's like, well, let's dig in to your financial model or your hiring plan or your product requirements, or like I have the patience and interest to kind of do maybe a working session versus like, hey, I'm a VC, I'm strategic, my
Hmm.
time's super valuable, and like, please only come to me for those kinds of things. So I think it's availability, honestly. um, and then connections. People come to me when they want, do you know this customer, this corporate partner, this VC? I think they're always blown away. Part of it's just being in Silicon Valley forever. They're like, oh my God, you actually know everybody. And if I don't, I find a way to get to them. So I'll look up the person they want to meet and I'll see who I know that
Mm-hmm.
knows that person.
Mm-hmm.
And then I get the intro first and then I make the intro second. So just to connect them.
How do you turn off? Like, I could only imagine how you would try to juggle the different constraints on your time and attention, all the people that you start putting the feelers out and coordinating and plugging in different ways. And then all of a sudden you have 10 times more than you realize coming back at you. Now I understand why it takes so long to get a meeting with you.
I think don't we all struggle from that? I mean, I'm sure you wake up in the middle of the night too, thinking about a search you're working on, or um, I don't know that my brain does turn off. I do find it really hard to relax, but I have hobbies.
Hmm. Yeah.
I have friends. I have a lot of friends, and I find that we don't really talk about work. Like it's not like I'm hanging out with a bunch of other VCs and we're talking deals, and I mean, I have VC friends, but a lot of my friends work in other aspects of tech or not in tech at all. I love sports, so you're going to find me watching Warriors and 49er games with friends,
Nice.
cooking. I like to work out. I like to be in nature, so we have a beach house. We go there a lot. I like to hike, travel. I like to listen to music. I mean, if you're at our house, the music is pretty much on all the time,
Uh-huh.
depending on, who said it, different genres.
Yeah.
We also watch a million movies. My son's a screenwriting major, so that's kind of taken it to another level.
Whoa.
I mean, we always did watch a lot of movies, but now, like for the Oscars, we watch every single thing that was nominated and discuss it. um, so I can turn off, I can definitely do all those things, but my mind is always going and thinking through, my work. It's just really hard, I think, to turn off.
Well, I gotta ask, so does dad get involved these days at all? Do you consult with him? Do you bring him in for particular advisory services for your own world that you're in?
Sometimes I talk to him about deals, and he invested in my first fund, and he's very curious, and we sometimes do things together, like the Rice Business Plan competition, which he helped launch, and
Whoa.
we both served as judges, and he has a angel group in Houston that funds the prizes. One of the they raise millions for the companies. So definitely still enjoy talking to him about technology and venture, and there's a lot of people who are curious. I was walking with a friend last night who's not in tech, and I think I bored her for about 30 minutes on what I'd learned at a Stanford talk yesterday. um, some people humor me, but I love to share, things that I'm learning or trends or, so not just family, but friends.
Well, what do you see as the role of a pioneering investor in shaping kind of the future of the tech industry? I mean, you're clearly at the forefront, being in this really early stage with these commercialized technologies. What do you see as your role in that?
Honestly, I feel like, it's a small role, and I'm not just trying to be humble, but, I think, there's a lot of big funds out there, and, certain groups have outsized influence, right? And so, like, when I think about venture, I think a lot of people that are in venture today got lucky. There's a lot of really bright people, but venture kind of drew from certain schools like Stanford and MIT.
Hmm.
And then it sort of self-perpetuated by, bringing in portfolio CEOs as VCs. And so it really hasn't been that diverse. And the funds that used to be kind of my peers, back when I was at Seven Rosen Funds, have scaled enormously. And now people call them the elite funds. I don't think I felt elite back then. um, so there's this huge disparity of, fund size between the big funds and emerging managers. But I tell myself I am the first check, and I am, able to drive outsized returns. But at the same time, I'm also maybe able to, cast a wider net, and that's why I fund diverse founders, because I think they're going to do a better job. Diverse teams are going to do a better job. And I can show up, as a woman. And I think it's a critical juncture right now with, how quickly AI is moving, which is exciting, of course, but it's also dangerous. There's also a lot of concerns. And so we need sort of the less important people, if you will, like me, to, contribute. So that kind of gets me up and gets me, keeps me focused and keeps me on this track.
Well, I was going to ask you about some of the ethical considerations that you take into account when you're making investments, and was also curious to talk about this sort of diversity piece and founders leaning on you for maybe like a more female perspective, if that's the right way to put it. I'm married to a feminist, and we talk a lot about gender balance in our household, like ongoing, and I'm so curious what you had to say. I guess the ethical considerations is probably a little bit of a separate topic than maybe what you've encountered being a woman in this world, but in some ways they could go together in terms of how you put these teams together.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I consider my perspective to be primarily a female perspective. I do think that it's a diverse perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So as one example, being a people person is not often the most common trait in a lot of settings that I'm in. So I think people bring a richness of many things, not just their gender. And but it is a little disheartening when I think about, the numbers. So I founded an organization called Watermark when I was at Stanford Business School to, support women founders and VCs, and it scaled over 20 years and then was acquired by another organization. But when I think back on the metrics of like what percentage of VCs are women or what percentage of CEOs, or like the progress feels really, really slow.
It does on my side. It does on my side too. I have a client that's wanting a female sort of VP of sales in Chicago that's got this particular PLG background motion, and it's like the pool's tiny. And I'm like, well, do you want to relocate somebody
Yeah.
from the Bay Area? So it's yeah. What do we do about that? I mean, obviously, Watermark, you set out to, what was it, to influence more female founders? Was that the purpose of Watermark?
It was an organization that provided that kind of, advantage of connections, right? So that sort of naturally happen in some of the, let's just say the male networks or the Stanford networks or the, whatever those privileged networks are.
Mm-hmm.
So finding funding, finding hires, finding a sounding board. I kicked off a group called the CEO Council, which was sort of like, what's that organization today that supports women CEOs? Shoot, everyone loves it, but it's like where you have circles.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody needs sounding boards, support, connections, money. But what's going to change is, and this is exciting to me, is if you look at the graduate programs. So as an example, I'm on the computer science advisory board and also the engineering advisory board at UT Austin. And so I see these stats all the time. We focus on diversity of undergrads, grads, postdocs,
Mm-hmm.
faculty. And, the state of Texas is very diverse, and it's a public school, so they want, all those things to match the population. Anyway, the numbers are better than industry. So the percentage of graduate students, for example, which is a big pool for founding these deep tech companies, is more diverse. But that doesn't mean that, there's no friction or that there's no problems to solve. So sometimes it's spurring those folks to think about being entrepreneurial. So like when I do like a panel, I did a panel on like labs to launch with CEOs at UT a year or two ago. And I was really excited because there was like, I don't know, maybe 100 graduate students came, which is sort of unheard of, like at a Stanford.
Hmm.
um, and I'm sure not all of them were thinking about entrepreneurship, right? Or even have the vocabulary for it. So to see on the panel, by the way, we serve pizza and beer, so that's probably why they came. But um, there was, four CEOs who kind of came out of the same institution that they did, that had come out of UT and had funded, in this case, robotics companies. And then, a moderator who kind of who talked about, how early stage capital works. So anyway, so some of that, and all the schools have, incubators, coursework, some better than or in higher volume than others, but like that is going to create a whole generation, I think, of diverse founders. And I think in deep tech, we have an opportunity to, change wealth creation, right? And then it's a cycle, right? So a successful founder becomes a VC.
Yeah.
So we need to kind of have this virtuous cycle, um, kind of greased or accelerated or however you want to think about it.
Well, I hope so, because when people like me plug into these exec teams and their boards and I always ask the question, like, are there any active diversity initiatives? And I ask that in every sort of discovery call. And I'm shocked at how often people are surprised by that question. But then when I find people that are focused on it and it's a very intentional part of what they want a person like me to come in and support when it comes to talent pipelines. Um, and then their demands are like, hey, I want 75% of the pipeline to be this or that. I'm like, okay, well, I can't make people appear that fit these criteria. And so I hope,
That's hard. Yeah.
but I hope a lot of the work that you're talking about doing at the university level does over time trickle down into, or trickle up, trickle down into, the population of people I try to go and recruit and bring into these companies to build these teams.
Yeah, no, that's tough, right? I mean, they're hiring a professional though, so at least that means that they're not just relying on their own networks, which
Hmm.
may not be as diverse.
Yep.
I mean, I think people, their intentions are good or they want diversity, but then they also want to make a quick hire of somebody they've worked with
Yep.
before. Um, so expedient or what they perceive as, I don't know, an easier hire is going to take precedence or preference.
Hmm.
I think it's hard work. When I put on a summit at Carnegie Mellon, um, I wanted to make sure that we had panels and lab tours and talks um, and an audience, obviously, of corporates, and I wanted to make sure that the room was diverse. In fact, I'd attended a robotics conference there maybe 6 months before, where I looked around the room. It was like 500 people, and there was like 10 women.
Yeah.
So of course I had all the right intentions, but it was hard, right? Because I was constrained by um, the companies that were in Pittsburgh. You're constrained by certain things,
Yeah.
and you just have to work really, really hard. Um, so anyway, I don't want to diminish that it's difficult, but I think it's an imperative.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you're focused on it. I mean, this is part of our early conversation to invite you on the podcast. I mean, it was, I think maybe you'd even call it a requirement of sorts that you might have not explicitly said, but it was, how much are you focused on diversity in this podcast world? I mean, I can tell it's a big part of the lens that you look through and the mission that you have, and I align with it. And it sounds like we're both doing everything we can to champion more diversity. And I'm curious, when you talk about the diversity of the early stage teams that you fund, tell me in simple terms why. I don't want to just extrapolate that it's the diversity of thinking because of diverse backgrounds, but is it that simple that gives them, in your opinion, more um, of a higher probability of success than less diverse teams? Can you drill into that for a moment?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm good at characterizing that. It just seems intuitive to me that diverse backgrounds, diverse lenses of any sort,
Hmm.
especially in an AI world, are going to contribute to a better outcome,
Yeah.
better problem solving.
Yep.
The problems are very complex. You need nonlinear thinking. Um, I don't know. I've seen it, right? So I track it.
Hmm.
And I need to do, more measuring. But I mean, the research supports it. And it's also a global, these are global problems. And so it's not just, within the US, and it's nice to have teams that have a global component. Um, I don't know. I don't have a scientific model for it.
Yeah. Well, can we drill into some of this go-to-market stuff when it comes to the sort of common problems, challenges that exist when you're trying to commercialize some of these types of solutions? I mean, fundraising has been tough this last year. It sounds like I was interpreting what you said earlier about having to talk to like 100 new VCs that was a little bit of an unexpected thing. Is that because a lot of them
Or
washed?
family offices
Uh-huh.
or individuals.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
they weren't all VCs.
Oh, right, right, right. Was it because a lot of them just changed their investment strategy, or did some of them wash out?
I think this year a lot of VCs were focused on managing their portfolio,
Uh-huh.
right? So they had to do some amount of triage and inside led rounds, and so that didn't leave a lot of capital or time for new investments.
Got it. Yeah,
So
and
that
more
was the
particular.
primary reason.
Okay.
But yeah, in this environment, people do retrench. They say, "Oh, okay, we funded a robotics company, and we thought they were going to scale at this level, and they haven't yet.
Hmm.
So maybe we don't want to do anymore."
Yeah.
Or some of them had to shut companies down, right, and do down rounds. And so, but I think it's still early days in deep tech, and these are huge markets. So the demand signal did not go away.
Uh-huh.
But these companies, yeah, struggled to um, kind of right size. Like some of them, yeah, their burn rate was too high, um, or kind of focus is a big one, right? Like a lot of deep technology is applicable to many things, many use
Right.
cases, many
Right.
verticals.
Yep.
And within my portfolio and everybody else's, I think there was kind of a lack of focus. So I don't know.
Trying to be too many things to too many people.
Yeah, to me, down cycles are a great time to invest, and also a great kind of forcing function on better execution, but painful.
Well, when you think about these founders and some of the, working sessions that you're having, are there any patterns as a company, for example? I don't know if it's about stage, if it's like saying, hey, pre-seed to seed to Series A, or if it's a particular stage of their product commercialization, pivoting to different verticals, changing the product. I'm just curious, what are some of the main kind of core themes, whether it's this last year or the themes you've seen over the whole time you've been doing Grit? What are some of those
Yeah,
common
for sure.
challenges that founders face as they go through this sort of pre-seed stage commercialization go-to-market process?
And that's exactly what Zhao, Yin, and I are focused on at office hours
Hmm.
because there is a pattern, right? So, um, you have, let's say, a prototype and a potential pilot. You've lined up a pilot. But you need to kind of figure out, what are my milestones,
Hmm.
from pre-seed to seed, let's say. Um, how many pilots? Do those pilots need to convert to contracts, or do they need to just inform product requirements, or like what are the goals, for those pilots? So kind of that whole development, customer milestones, and then also hiring.
Hmm.
Um, how much can I outsource versus how many key technical hires do I need to make? What should my leadership team look like? This is where you come in, right?
Hmm.
Um, what makes me more fundable, essentially.
Yeah.
And it's very sector specific. And VCs have very different opinions on all these things. And, so I try to kind of educate a pre-seed entrepreneur on some clusters, like, and talk to them about targeting, that I don't want you to waste your time going after the wrong list of investors, like.
Hmm.
And then I'll kind of talk to them about, like, okay, here's the milestones I think you're going to reach, let's say for seed. Here's the investors that I think are going to be interested in your sector, who write checks that are the appropriate size, who are going to think that you have enough traction, whatever, like all that matching. Um, because they waste so much time, the ones that are not experienced or don't get help,
Hmm.
on going out and trying to raise money from the wrong sources, or they call it a Series A when it's a seed. And
Hmm.
blow through a bunch of no's. And anyway, so I think that whole process around milestones is important. And then financials, right? Like, I actually believe fractional CFOs can make such a huge difference earlier on,
Mm-hmm.
looking at like unit economics and kind of maybe you're not where you want to be, but like, how are you going to get there? How are you going to convince the investors that, you're on a path to decent margins, that this sector, this use case, this, opportunity you're going after is going to be supportive of a profitable, exciting business. And the financial skill set is so different, I think, than the technical.
Yeah.
A lot of my first time founders are PhDs out of the labs. They haven't built financial models.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're smart, but there's a lot to it. So trying to kind of bring that in earlier.
Mm-hmm. Tell me more about looking into this coming up year. If you had a crystal ball, are you seeing what are you hoping for? Are you seeing any
Yeah,
early?
remember, I'm an optimist.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Um, what do you see happening kind of in the next 12 to 18 months in terms of just I don't know if it's the fundraising landscape or just the ease of sales.
Yeah. Well, I'll cover my ass and say I think it's going to be another tough year. Um,
Safe.
because and I am telling my portfolio execs that, right? I mean, make cash last, like raise extension rounds, whatever. Like, don't assume that in the middle of 2024 the world is, a different place and you're going to be able to raise a big round and life is good. And so I think M&A is probably not going to turn on again for a while. Let's just say late 2024. I mean, the major, Fortune 500 or whatever in the U.S. are still very acquisitive. They still have to make big transitions. If you're an equipment manufacturer in ag or construction or whatever, you still need to electrify your fleet. You still need autonomous, operation. So anyway, all the demand is there, and the M&A will eventually kick back in, and hopefully the IPO market. But what I think is what I'm hopeful about, and this is more to my mission, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
is that we need the emerging hubs of technology in the U.S., the big economies, right? Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania. We need them to flourish, right? To become innovation economies, to have companies scale, right? I mean, yes, Amazon can show up and scale warehouses or whatever, but we need to have, the emergence of big technology companies. So I'll give you the state of Texas as an example. There's
Mm-hmm.
5 fabs being built there. So kind of a resurgence of semiconductors. And UT got 500 million in grant money from the state for chip packaging technology. So that's kind of the role they want to play in this new semiconductor economy.
And when you say when you say fabs, you mean fabrication?
Yeah, large scale fabrication,
Mm-hmm.
multi-billion dollar. But okay, so the reason why I'm excited about that is it creates jobs,
Right.
right? We need to create jobs in all these states. We need people to participate in this new economy to kind of heal the divide in this country.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely on my mind. We also need to reshore a lot of stuff, right? So it's going to take a while, by the
You
way.
mean
I
like
mean, even those
infrastructure,
5,
like infrastructure? You mean or
yeah, semiconductors and hardware and um, even with those 5 fabs in Texas, and there's others being built, like it is a tiny fraction of the chips that, our companies want to consume. And so, geopolitical issues are going to make that all challenging, but we
mm-hmm.
need, we need clean energy solutions. We don't even mine lithium. I mean, we don't control a lot of the source, if you will. We don't have the equipment for, battery production.
Mm-hmm.
Most of that comes from China. So even if we want to gear up factories, like we don't control the supply chain. So that's why I'm excited about the Infrastructure Act and the kind of billions of dollars that are flowing into this.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's nuclear or hydrogen production or even wind and solar. But there's a lot that comes after that, right? It's not just kind of creating those sources. It's improving our grid, and manufacturing. So I hope that this coming year is one where, as a country, we don't lose what's the word, our confidence or our drive, around investing in all this stuff. We have to.
Yeah. I really find it valuable the more examples that you give about what excites you. I found that so helpful to have you get more into these different scenarios. So if you were to imagine next year, I mean, you have a pipeline of deals you're sourced for next year. You're still deploying capital and you're
Hmm.
raising fund too, right?
Yes.
So can we just talk a little bit more about these sectors and their impact? I know there's, I don't know, what, three or four or five that you have categorized. Can we just drill into
Yeah.
those real
No.
quick?
We have them all mapped out. Actually, that's one thing I learned early in my career, is that you need to know what you're looking for, and you need to see everything in a given sector.
Uh-huh.
So it's not just sitting back and going, "Gee, I hope some interesting, robotics deals come my way." In
Right.
Fund One, we were like, we want to see manufacturing, ag, construction, logistics, robotics.
Yeah.
Um, and now that robotics is scaling, there's sort of a new set of challenges. And now that, Moore's law has ended and we can't just count on hardware to get cheaper, faster, it's kind of shifted my attention toward intelligence and applications.
Hmm.
And so when you think about robotics scaling, they need to be reliable, they need to perform, and they need to perform as well as a human, if not better.
Hmm.
And some of them, have been very greedy, if you will, in their resources that they demand. Compute power and bandwidth, and they're going to have to become more efficient. So I think it's kind of like a new era of performance-based application design.
Hmm.
Also, the hardware. It's not that okay, Moore's law is over, but we still need to improve the hardware, right? It needs to be lower cost. We talked earlier about unit economics.
Yep.
For most of these customers, like, if you take a construction site or a factory, or, they need to see a return on investment within 6 months. They're not investing in multi-year kind of
Hmm.
ROI.
Hmm.
So anyway, so continuing to build on service business models and, making greater efficiencies happen,
So when
not
you like robotics,
not
like
just labor replacement.
robotics as a service is a kind of an innovative model, right? Compared to the CapEx structure of prior.
Right. And I mean, that was a great way for these startups to get into these big customers,
Hmm.
because they didn't have to buy a big multi-million-dollar kind of contract. Um, but replacing one human with one robot, and by the way, it's not replacing humans, these are jobs that are going unfilled, that's not what we need to see. We need to see scale. We
Hmm.
need to redesign some of these factory floors or these job processes, or one robot eventually can replace, say 3 human jobs and increase output and increase visibility, through the kind of industrial intelligence you're going to get from all the data you're collecting.
Hmm.
So it's like, I don't know, we're entering a new phase, right, of scale and sort of intelligence and greater operational efficiency. And so you're thinking, well, what's going to enable that? And I think, people got all excited about Chat GPT and large language models, but
Hmm.
generative AI applied to the physical world is super exciting.
Oh, tell me
Um,
more.
so, well, I mean, I think it's multimodal models, right? So it's not just language, but video and images,
Uh-huh.
and there's been a real acceleration of progress. I went to see Dr. Fei Li speak. She just wrote a book. She's created Stanford's Humanized AI Center, and
Hmm.
she's been in AI for decades, and is a real pioneer. And she talked about this acceleration. I forget the name of her book now. I should remember, but um, the worlds we see, or something like that. But I'm seeing that as well. I'm seeing some acceleration of the AI, and like use cases that it will enable for robotics. But anyway, those aren't the only areas. I'm also excited about Connectivity.
Uh-huh.
We still need to increase connectivity. We need to bring in new materials. We need to deploy charging infrastructure for all the robotics and eventually AVs. We need to improve our grid. So grid modernization. We need on the robotic side, we're mostly indoors, so doing stuff that's sort of what I call big yard logistics
Mm-hmm.
or kind of in the wild.
Mm-hmm.
Even things like autonomous rail. There's still like so many things to do in each of these
Yeah.
categories.
Yeah.
So when we're sourcing at the lab level, we're kind of looking for, certain breakthroughs.
Why did you do Grit Ventures? I mean, it sounds like it's pretty obvious. There's like a grittiness to this whole thing. Was there a lot of thought put into that?
Well, the name came from I was talking to my old boss from Sun Microsystems, Dick Silman, who's a great hardware leader, and we were talking about the grit that it takes to build a hardware-based business. So
Yeah,
that's where that came from.
got it.
And before it became a popular term, I will say. But yeah, that goes back to it's not glamorous. I mean, I think everyone has this notion of like, and I meet a lot of like business school students who think this way, like, oh, I'm going to start a company and I'm going to be wildly successful. And they can point to several, that have come out of their university or among their friends even.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I'm going to make a ton of money. But, for every one of those, there's hundreds of failures and, companies that are only mildly successful or anyway, I think it's like a true mission. You have to want to take risk. You have to be willing to work without a lot of support, like all the resources you would have in a bigger company to
Hmm.
pursue something. I mean, it's exhilarating, right? It's like, and it can be incredibly rewarding financially and otherwise. But it better be what you love doing. And for me, this cross between or this edge of like, I'm not a founder and I'm not, part of the team, but I'm sort of filling in some gaps early on, is very exciting, right? You get to be kind of operational, and at the same time, you're making these really tough decisions about where to invest.
Yeah,
And with a limited fund size, right? It's if you have
yeah.
a huge fund size and you could just pump it out, like those decisions aren't quite as hard.
Well, so talk about the assembly of these teams that you are having pitch you all the time. What kind of patterns are you finding that really early give you a sense of, wow, this is a special one, versus the things that are like, uh-oh, and you see it real quick that they sort of have you dismiss certain people pitching you.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of like uh-ohs,
Hmm.
um, maybe I'll just give some examples. So like in robotics, first of all, it needs to be a use case that's here and now, right? Like there's customers who are desperate for the solution because typically labor shortages.
Hmm.
Um, and that's almost every industry, literally every industry.
Okay, so check that one
I
off.
mean,
Yeah.
I have seen, robots that move chickens around in chicken farms. By the way, I learned a lot about chicken farms and how much roast chicken we all eat out of Costco. And, um, you need them everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Or cleaning a ship hull or inspecting a bridge or, I mean, you name it. But it needs to be clear, like who those customers are and, what they can pay for it based on the margins of their business. And so if a team comes to me out of the labs, and one did once, I probably shouldn't say that it was an elite institution,
Okay.
and they told me that for their particular use case, that the bill of materials, what it costs to build in low volume, was $500,000. I'm like, guys, I just need to end the call right now. Like that's a non-starter, but I walked them through it. Like, let's look at this from the customer's perspective. What's the ROI going to be? And then how are your unit economics going to look? And also because I see a lot, I can tell them like, I've seen 3 other companies in this space and you need to be in the 100K range.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it doesn't mean that they won't get there or even beat out those competitors. These are very smart entrepreneurs who move quickly. But anyway, there's certain pitfalls. There's certain assumptions people make, or because they're first time entrepreneurs typically.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. So I'm curious when you think about the assembly of these teams. I talk to founders, and they're like, "We need somebody that's going to look good on our Series A pitch deck." So they need to have this logo or this school. And I'm wondering, you're primarily meeting people coming out of these universities that are highly educated, right? So you're seeing people that have come up through these top-notch schools, right? That are at the top of at the the leading edge of their field. Um, I guess you have to help them figure out how to fill in those go-to-market gaps, because a lot of times they're not going to have the ability to know how to fundraise well. They're not going to know how to connect with customers, maybe just because they don't have the interpersonal skills, but they see the problem and they need people to kind of bridge that gap. So are you finding oftentimes there's obvious gaps? I mean, in finance, which you've talked about, what are you seeing in
Mm-hmm.
terms of these founders' ability to bridge the gap with sort of the go-to-market portion of customer acquisition and um, product management, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest gap. So if the founder is, let's just say it's a PhD, it doesn't mean that they don't have any business acumen. I mean, some of them have actually had entrepreneurial experiences
Hmm.
even before they pursue their PhD, or during the summers, or they've taken courses, or and if they're at universities like Stanford or MIT, they have a wealth of people around
Yeah.
to kind of help them up that learning curve. So sometimes they're better at it than you might think. But typically they need to bring on some business talent, and it's hard to attract a killer business exec for below market salary in a company that only has $1.5 million in the bank, or
Uh-huh.
it's not. I mean, I doubt that you would be super successful even as a really good search person. So you might fill in the gaps with interim executives, with experts who are available to you for whatever reasons.
Hmm.
Like, for example, people get those through incubators,
Hmm.
or advisors. I'm a big fan of advisors, although I try to kind of make sure they're strategic about it. Like, so one of my companies didn't have a business founder, and needed to accelerate their customer discovery process, and they had potential pilots, but like, which ones do you choose, and
Hmm.
which cluster,
Hmm.
which
Cohort.
characteristics.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and so they brought on an interim executive who was well connected in the Silicon Valley, so that helped. And he assembled an advisory board of, think of it as like sales execs.
Hmm.
I mean, they typically were sales execs in other companies in the same space,
Hmm.
not competitive, but like they had
Brilliant.
connections. So kind of as their side hustle, they generated leads, and this experienced interim executive quickly culled through them, and before we knew it, we had like 6 incredible pilots lined up that
Amazing.
yeah, and that doesn't usually happen as smoothly, but and that's why Zhao and I are trying to create that through office hours, is like not only kind of having these sessions for the founders, but like building out the type of advisors, experts, and resources that could help on an interim basis.
Hmm.
By the way, it could also be your investors. If you have individual investors or people who can spend more time, active chairs. There's a variety of ways to fill in those gaps.
We'll have to talk offline about an offer I've come up with that's specifically for that purpose, because I see that gap too, where they don't
Oh,
they don't
cool.
need a full-time person, but you can build strategic pipes of and it's cool to think of having an advisor sort of corral those people and play sort of the chair, if you will, of that group, and support the founder that's pulled in a million directions on how to commercialize and get traction with customers. So yeah, that's super exciting. I love that
Cool. Yeah, let's talk about it.
I love that you're doing that. Well, why don't we talk about what you're focused on for the next 12 to 18 months, just in terms of, we've talked about kind of trends and what you might see happening, but what particularly for you are you focused on in the next 12 to 18 months that the people listening might be able to help you with?
Well, I think we need to see liquidity in deep tech, right? And we talked earlier about how M&A may not happen until the end of 2024.
Hmm.
But I continue to expand my industry partner universe, and not just the venture and innovation groups, but understanding what the operating groups are looking for. Where do they need to fill in the gaps? What bets are they willing to make in terms of acquisitions? And so we need to see liquidity across deep tech.
Hmm.
I I mean, I'm always looking for deal flow, right? And I'm focused proactively on certain schools. So Stanford, UT, Carnegie Mellon. Um, but I think this technology is resident across the U.S.
Hmm.
And there's a lot happening, for example, in Los Angeles, coming out of UCLA, USC, Caltech. So anyway, deal flow is always great. um, Key hires. I think that we were just talking about this sort of the challenge of hiring business execs in year one. I think we've had a lot of layoffs and downsizing, and I think there's a lot of talent out there. And I can't always my companies can't always afford a search process,
Right.
but I think I need to build out more of this business talent, particularly for the non-Silicon Valley geographies.
Hmm.
And it doesn't necessarily mean people have to move. There are hybrid roles, and but we do need more business talent in Pittsburgh and Austin and Atlanta um, to really scale these startups. Um, I I mean, I have a lot of other personal goals for next year. Those are kind of more industry wide. Hoping to bring on a new partner, um, maybe raise fund three towards the end of 2024. Um, and I hope that investors have courage to invest in what is really essential
Hmm.
for this country. And I think we'll deliver outsized returns, but I think it's essential.
And do you get the feeling that we're at like a real tipping point? That's the sense I'm getting, and I'm obviously deep in the world for a long time now. But it feels to me like technology. I mean, maybe it's partially this AI wave that's happened in the last 12 months, but um, I, especially with these older industries and their just awareness of what's possible, seems at a higher point than it's ever been before. It's probably because of the publicity that AI is getting.
Yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword, right? I think there are a lot of older businesses that have tried innovation and it hasn't worked,
Hmm.
like, or it didn't scale, or it was too expensive, or so there is some scar tissue out there.
Right.
Um, but they're still looking, they're still eager.
Hmm.
And um, by the way, it's not just the older industries, it's also the Fortune 500 businesses who know that their business needs to change, either their production methodology, the level of automation,
Hmm.
or their supply chain, how they get it to the customers. So I think the if the government continues to pump out money, and it's, by the way, it's federal and state. If all the different agencies continue to give grants, from DOE and DARPA and all of
Hmm.
them, if we can continue to kind of fuel the early stage, and then if we can find sort of the bolder sources of capital um, for true scale, which might come from private equity, right? When the unit economics are there,
Hmm.
um, then I think we can see some major progress in terms of GDP, job growth, the things that kind of affect the economy at a higher level.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know. I mean, we've got an election pending. We've
Hmm.
got, we're coming out of a down cycle, war going on.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
I, you know, I worry. Um, but I think again, focusing on the root, the universities gives me so much hope,
Mm.
right? Because like just smart young people,
Focused.
yeah, and just the breakthroughs are there. By the way, it's not like we can't solve climate change. I'm not saying it's easy, but like A lot of it is, funding and ruthless execution and cooperation. But, like keeping our focus on solving global problems, we could do it.
Well, if we talk about just a further out forecast, I like to ask this question just for fun, and you can put whatever disclaimers you want around it. But if you think about your most exciting sort of 5-year crystal ball, whether it's for Grit Ventures or for you personally or both, would be kind of fun. But what are you? I love when you talk about what you're excited about because the tone of your voice changes and there's so much energy and passion there because I can see that you are very visionary. So however you want to put this in a container, um, walk me through a 5-year vision that would be just absolutely phenomenal for you and Grit or your personal world, whatever you want to share.
Um, well, I hope within 5 years, and I don't want to get too political,
Mhm.
but I hope we can see real progress on social issues, and a real, less of the disparity of wealth. So if and I told you about the state of Texas being a very diverse
Yeah.
state. It's also incredibly conservative right now
Hmm.
at the, government level. So, but imagine 5 years from now that we've educated a more diverse population and we've elected more progressive leaders there and we've created jobs and, like that goes such a long ways to, making this a better country. And that could happen in a variety of states, partly with generational shifts, so millennial and Gen Z just
Hmm.
naturally being more progressive, um, but also that redistribution of wealth.
Hmm.
But that just feels a little, that sounds a little bit lofty for 5 years. But I continue to try to picture that as a north star of change. Um, and where education is not as expensive,
Hmm.
which is a whole nother big set of problems, right? Coming out of undergrad or graduate owing hundreds of thousands of dollars, versus a kid who doesn't. That's not a level playing field.
Right.
um, so if we could like continue to solve those hard problems and turn the tide a little, in global warming. I mean, every fraction of a degree matters.
Hmm.
Um, I want my kids and ultimately, if they have children, I want them to have hope. Like it's pretty bleak when they look out at the future. I want them to feel a sense of hopefulness. It takes change at every level, right?
Yeah.
So, just as a silly example, a friend of a friend was like, a guy was mansplaining the power of diversity to me a year ago. And I thought, "Oh, this is excellent, right? Because if a white man is evangelizing it,
Uh-huh.
maybe it could happen." But no, we need to see the dollars flowing, right? Like, I'll just talk about my industry, like LPs, who manage like huge pension plans are starting to put pressure on the venture industry to be more diverse,
Mm.
right? Or, to have more diverse boards.
Mhm.
And, states have put in place regulation. California, and we, some people hate us, um, has pioneered in all these areas of social change and the environment. And imagine if other states, and there are some, but like imagine if the majority of the states started to follow and there was real momentum, right? From a, like, let's just take regulatory
Mhm.
environment. Um, like that could drive change. And then being involved in the universities, like if they can continue, like for example, in the state of Texas, you can't have diversity programs now, and I guess nationwide the Supreme Court's kind of restricted that as well. Like, how we creatively get around that
Mhm.
and still drive diversity, and also it's uh, socioeconomic,
Mhm.
right? So, but it to me, it's not like a silver bullet or who the governor is. It's like all the grassroots programs.
Mhm.
Um, I'm trying to keep faith that collectively, that we mostly care about the same things. um, and that if we have some generational shifts and some leadership changes and like just some things that could tip us over,
Hmm.
that the momentum is already there. Are you as hopeful as I am?
You have such a different perspective, and it's making me think so much larger and wider. I mean, I've always known that there's a lot of the politics of things are such a huge inhibitor of so much progress and change. So that's just given me a whole bunch of new things to think about. Yeah, I mean, I'm an optimist as well. So, and I have children, and I know that they look at the state of things, and they're being exposed to environmental situations, and animals being extinct, and the oceans getting warmer, and
Ugh,
I mean it's
yeah.
overwhelming as a parent to be faced with the look on their faces that I didn't know that was going to feel that way. And so wondering, what can we do, what can you do, what can I do on a day-to-day basis. That's what's inspiring to me, is to see these different assemblies of groups of people, and the lab, and the different innovations you're trying to champion, and the different universities that keep you hopeful about the breakthroughs being there, and then seeing where the problems are, and being able to come on podcasts like this and talk about it from a more broad perspective, I think is so needed. Um, so yeah, I'm more hopeful now than I was before, and I was already pretty hopeful. So yeah, awesome. Why don't we transition? I want to talk on a personal level for a little bit as we kind of start to work to wrap this up. Just for fun, what is something that's happened to you, Jennifer, in your life or career that few people will believe?
uh, well, there's negative and positive things, right? But like in the Me Too movement, I remember a lot of men who I really respect and like, and they're like, "Well, that never happened to you, did it, Jennifer?" I'm like, "Are you kidding?" Like, I think every single woman I know has dealt with sexual harassment. So anyway, that shouldn't be a surprise, but I
Hmm.
guess for some people it is. But one funny story, I joined a venture fund right out of business school. In fact, TVI was the firm that had funded Sun Microsystems. TVI eventually kind of juggled with Merrill Pickard and became Benchmark in August, if you probably know them
Uh-huh.
better.
Yeah.
But anyway, TVI was they had funded Microsoft. My partner, David Marquardt, was on the board. I was an associate. And it was like my first 6 months in venture. And he's like, Jennifer, I'm hosting. He was really good friends with Bill Gates because he'd been on the board forever, been the early investor. And he's like, I'm hosting Bill Gates' engagement party, and everyone in the firm is coming. I'm like, oh, all right. I mean, and Bill Gates wasn't, he was a big deal, but he wasn't as big a deal, obviously, as he is today. And he's like, and by the way, it's Halloween, so it's a costume party.
Okay.
Like, okay. He lived in Hillsborough, like a mansion, and my husband, who loves a good black tux, like or white tails, or like he's like, let's go as Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio, which is convenient for him, right?
Sure.
Like he just puts on a good looking suit, and he's a very handsome man, I will say. But I had to wear like a blonde wig and a dress that would work, and like, but I thought, it's going to be crowded, and we'll just slink in, slink out, or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but when we got there, it turned out every guest was announced.
Oh.
Like, so it was like in the backyard.
Oh, wow.
I remember Tim Draper and his wife were in front of us, just as a note. But anyway, I was so mortified because I mean, I wasn't, as a woman in venture, I generally wore like really baggy suits and, no nail polish or jewelry, no open toed shoes. Like at that time, you were really just trying to fit in and look
Uh-huh.
like a man, I guess.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
um, so I don't know, this was obviously questionable judgment going as Marilyn Monroe, but um, anyway, got through that. And then I was seated with Melinda Gates's, all her best friends from college and some of her family members. And I just think about what a trip that evening was. And there were several events like that in my life where like people would be impressed with the importance of the person there,
Hmm.
but it's really not what I was thinking about. I was thinking about how to fit in. or as a woman in business and a woman in technology, and how to not embarrass myself. I was a lot younger, like when I joined venture. The average age was a lot older than it is now. And in telecom, all the founders were like in their 50s and 60s coming out of Bell Labs. And so just, feeling very self-conscious as a young woman, and then having situations like that was challenging.
Dressed up like Marilyn Monroe.
By the way, my husband, Halloween is his favorite holiday. So every year for many years, and maybe you do this because you have kids, like he would basically order costumes for us and be like, "Hey, so this year I'm Shrek and you're Fiona,"
Uh-huh.
or
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I did not have a choice. But we developed quite a costume bank. All our neighbors would come borrow from it,
Oh, that's awesome.
which is a lot of fun. So I'll credit him with that.
All right. Switching gears to talk about hiring for just a moment. What can you recall as one of the biggest hiring mistakes or horror stories that you've ever heard about or seen? And what do you think should have been done different?
Oh, God. I mean, I don't have too many, thankfully, from Grit, and partly because these are still seed A, B companies, and it's not like they're 1,000 employees and they've made a bunch of hires and turned over a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of management.
Mm-hmm.
And
But
I
a
think
hire at this stage is so important because you lose time, right?
that's true. No, that's true. I love a good search person. I have to say that to you. I like when you have a situation where you can turn an advisor into a hire, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that was always the intention. Like you bring on we're talking earlier about business advisors or interim executives, kind of a try before you buy.
Yep.
Because I think it's really hard to kind of paste on someone who doesn't know the founder, doesn't know the executive team at all, and that chemistry and all that may not, gel. And people have different situations in life. Some people need to make more money than others. Some haven't had a win, some have. I mean, I don't know, all those issues around kind of alignment and making it work. You can have flexibility, right? You can, for example, pay one exec more and have that person take less equity, or
Mm-hmm.
you can be creative in dealing with those differences. But I don't know, I've just, over the course of my entire career, I've had, many nightmares of probably everything you can think of. Like the worst case is like when executives make threats against each other, like where you actually fear for your safety,
Uh-oh.
or where you have really divisive people who, kind of try to, factionalize a company,
Mm-hmm.
create a coup. I mean, sometimes a coup is the right thing, but anyway, like all of those kind of tumultuous divisions, which are often based on the personalities of, a few people,
Right.
are so difficult.
Well, some of the egos that would come together. I mean, I could imagine a team that worked together in a lab environment going out into the world and starting to see the potential of what's possible. And I don't know. I don't know if there's a pattern you've seen where there's a lot more founders that come together in an early team in deep tech than maybe like a SaaS company, where there's a lot more
um,
of fighting over things that happen at the later
no,
stages.
nerds get along. Um, no, I mean, and by the way, one reason why I went into engineering was I really thought if the primary goal is building something exciting,
Yeah.
um, that can unite people in a very kind of pure way. Yes, today they want to make money and all that, but you still find that motive of like creation, invention, like bringing something to life, versus, and not to pick on like a finance person, but you're in there to build models and count numbers, and um, it's a highly trained skill set, but it's very different. Anyway, a lot of these founding teams get along really beautifully. Many of them had worked together,
Mm-hmm.
like a faculty and a postdoc, or a postdoc and graduate students,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe they, had worked together in another startup, and this was their turn to be founders. And a lot of them have kind of a model of what kind of culture they'd like to create, or now the problem can be that it works really well for that group and then it doesn't scale or it doesn't encompass other people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you might have a really productive, nice culture for the first 6 months of development, but now you need to add in business people or technical people who have very different skill sets. Like now you're adding software people to the hardware team. I'm simplifying,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think, knowing that the company needs to evolve and needs to go beyond the personalities of the founders, and needs to be professional, and needs to, hire people like you who are going to diversify their team. I mean, all those things like have to happen, and those can be difficult transitions.
Yeah. Yep. What about on the flip side, for the biggest successes you've seen in a hiring context? Anyone in particular stand out that was a real home run, and anything that you can glean from it that others could adopt or learn from?
Um, well, I'll just speak to one aspect of that, which is back to diversity. We looked at our portfolio and we looked at like where we had a diverse founder, women, and sometimes women and underrepresented minority or just underrepresented minority, and then looked at like how the team evolved, um, and the companies where the more diverse founders and the more diverse team to begin with, the easier it was for them
Mm.
to continue to be diverse, and we measure like percentage of the employee base, percentage of executives, founders, and then board.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see the advantage starts day one.
Hmm.
And so I think about that. Like it's really hard to go from 20 white guys to a diverse
Yeah.
team.
Yeah.
um, and anyway, so that's just one metric of success. I think there's all these other obvious things like, early traction or being able to raise a lot of money, the quality of the syndicate. Like there's all these things that make it easier to hire,
Mm-hmm.
great people. Geography matters, sector matters.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that, so deep tech, we've talked about the risks, and, we haven't had huge successes yet, but there is the hiring advantage of people want to join companies where there's a positive global impact.
Yep.
So one guy I recently recruited for a VP role could have gone to NVIDIA, which is a wildly successful company,
Mm-hmm.
or join an ag tech startup. And he was a repeat entrepreneur and he had choices. And but I think it was more meaningful to him to, join the ag tech startup and work on, ag is tremendously affected by, climate change at a time when we really need it to be, higher production um, and, less emissions. So anyway, I think you can sometimes attract really great people based on a mission.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So if you could go back in time and tell yourself one thing earlier in your career, what would you say?
Well, okay, I'm the type of person who doesn't have regrets. So I had many mistakes and fuck ups, but I tend to not like look at them and say, "Oh my God, I shouldn't have done that," or
Mm-hmm.
"if only," or whatever. I tend to live more in the present and the future. However, um, I think that there were times when I wasn't super flexible. I think the flip side of a very driven, hardworking, focused person is maybe you can be stubborn or not so flexible. And when I left Seven Rosen Funds, there were several VC firms that you know tried to recruit me, and at the time I was like, I want to work for a more diverse firm, not a firm that's just all guys. I want to do my own thing. I had a very kind of singular mission then. And I look back, and a lot of those are really great funds today. And maybe I would have only stayed 5, 10 years, but it would have been a lot easier to raise my fund coming off of, the success of one of those versus, the struggle of launching an emerging, fund
Mm-hmm.
10 years after I'd left. So some degree of flexibility. And then I also wonder if maybe I shouldn't have been a VC. I mean, not because I don't love it and it isn't, it's a beautiful thing. And honestly, it was a great way to have a family too, because, you don't manage huge teams.
Uh-huh.
Um, but it's lonely. And when I think about like friends I know that stayed on the operating side, and who've been really successful, and I know it's a grind, so maybe the grass is always greener, but like I think I could have been really happy as a CEO or executive, um, managing. I mean, hopefully it would have been like a startup that scaled versus like going to a giant company.
Hmm.
Um, but I just wonder if I always picked kind of the hard path. And I kind of wonder if there was a path that was maybe not as hard, which would lead to, a more balanced life. um, it's stressful, less stress.
But you're probably going to end up being like your parents, where you're in your 80s, still just hustling. I can see that.
Well, that's the goal.
Yeah.
By the way, I read today that Khosla, I think he's 68, and
Uh-huh.
he said, I'm going to work for 25 more years.
Vinod?
Like, how do you know that?
Vinod 68?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what it said. Yeah, it's 25 years. Like, okay, that's certainly entirely possible.
Yeah.
Anyway, that is my aspiration. I guess that's his. Because I think that it's not that I want to grind away and for 25 more years or however many, but it's that it keeps you young.
Hmm.
Learning and being curious, keeps your mind young. It keeps you hopeful. It just has so many benefits, right? Like when the thought of like retiring and playing golf or something, I mean, that just sounds soul deadening to me. um, and that sounds terrible because I know that a lot of people enjoy that.
Well, but you're you're
But
you're
for
you're wired, you're wired differently. I mean, right?
Yeah, no, I am. I'm probably as crazy as my parents.
Well, and you had at one point thought about the CEO track. You'd mentioned that a couple of times, right? Where that had been the vision, and then you
Mhm.
ended up here, like following in dad's footsteps in some interesting way. But
Yeah.
but you see,
Well, he got to be a CEO along the way, so
hmm
I skipped a step.
Do you think there's still a possibility that's in your future?
Um, I think about it, like I don't have I mean, I did a startup as a co-founder, and I was chair and I was head of marketing and product, and but my co-founder was CEO. That was by choice. I didn't want to be at the time.
Hmm.
Um, and it was tough. Like that was 5 years of, it's really hard work. So I have no, misunderstandings about what it is. But I do get excited about things. And if I thought I could be helpful in getting something launched, probably as an interim CEO, and it was the right timing between funds, or I don't know, like, or I had partners who could manage the fund, I could definitely see doing that.
But it doesn't sound like it would
You
be
know,
easier. It sounds like it would. Maybe I'm wrong here, but maybe it would allow you to just focus in a different way than you've been so spread out with doing so many things for so many groups and people.
yeah, no, you're right. It's a different kind of stress, but it's super focused.
Hmm.
But when you were asking about looking back in my career, that was more like envisioning going back, 20,
Hmm.
30 years ago and choosing like the operating path.
Hmm.
And so that's entirely different than like being an interim CEO of a startup in my portfolio.
Right. Do you feel the
So,
tug on you when you talk to them and you're like, man, I could really get in there and solve some of those problems? That's got to happen to you.
um, not as much as you think. I like to be in the working session or a sounding board, but I'm keenly aware that, they're sort of purpose built for it usually. That technology, that opportunity. I don't purport to, you know, be able to do a better job than they are. I just like to be helpful. Um, but I love thinking about, kind of what needs to happen.
Hmm.
Um, kind of the strategy and the pieces and the um, I don't know. It's like a puzzle, right? And it's either like coming together, it's not, and the pieces don't always fit, and like I don't know. So I think when you're on the funding side, you can step back and you can have a more objective look at everything.
Hmm.
They're like deeply in it, doing it.
Yeah.
I can look at it and say, you know what, I think, this is not a customer we want to go after, or that's a product feature that can wait, or, the business model is not quite right, or whatever. I can be more objective.
Uh-huh. You can help them see the forest for the trees, right?
Yeah, definitely. And be a cheerleader. I think, it sounds like a cliche, but I think as a parent, which by the way, I think that's the hardest job I've ever had,
Right.
of 3 kids, you become really efficient. You are a great problem solver. As I mentioned, my kids called me the fixer.
Uh-huh.
Um, I think I apply a lot of that learning to working with, my founders, and also kind of the nurturing and caring that you get from a parent. I think I try to give that as a VC. I know it
Mm-hmm.
sounds a little sappy, but um, like I believe in them. I want their dream to come true. Like it isn't just, are you going to make me money? Um, and I hope that kind of nurturing
Mm-hmm.
um, is, you know, makes a difference.
I would hope there's more of people that see things that way. I think there's probably a big gap in a lot of the founders' worlds are probably void of a lot of that. I'm just getting a sense of that. I don't think there's a whole lot of that energy going on when there needs to be.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, talking about new entrepreneurs, I want to ask you to put yourself in the shoes of one of our listeners out there who, let's imagine they're a brand new entrepreneur, just starting out. Do you have any just high level advice for things they should avoid, or any tips for having a higher probability of being successful?
Yep. One is be humble. Like, know what you don't know. And I know that as a CEO, you have to kind of act like you know everything and instill confidence, and but at the same time, you got to be on a learning curve for so many different functions and aspects of your job. So just being humble, being willing to hire great people and not being greedy about equity. Big red flag for me would be, the CEO has, a hugely disproportionate amount of the equity and they don't want to give it up and they're controlling. And, so willingness to bring on, great people and willing to share the equity. I think looking for value added capital, and I'm biased on this, but looking for value added capital versus just money at the highest valuation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of an obvious thing to say, and but in the moment you have to actually think about it, like, okay, I'm going to really look hard for partners, for venture partners, for operating partners, for customer partners. Like, I'm going to really try to um, team up with, where there's alignment, and I'm not going to be greedy again. It's not going to be just the highest valuation, and we're going to build something together and it's going to be more valuable. It's hard to do, right?
Yeah, I've had a lot of experience with investors that have different perspectives on that. I've recently hooked up with an investment company that has just a wildly different approach to partnership that felt like night and day. And I talked to their founders, and I just hear the feedback that's I feel like they're being nurtured, like you talked about, in a way. They feel like true partnership. It's not just a bunch of fluff and um, people saying they offer support and do all this unique stuff, and then it's not really happening on the backside. So
Mm.
yeah, I can totally understand that, and I think that advice you gave is great. What about for an experienced CEO that's looking ahead at what's happening in the world and wanting to make sure they're staying on the cutting edge and able to continue to get ahead? Any advice for someone that's got the
Yeah.
experience?
Well, several things. I think, they naturally bring co-founders or hires from their previous company, and that's great.
Hmm.
When you have that kind of working chemistry, and but I think you need to infuse new, at the leadership level or founder level, or because whatever you're doing is different, and you've evolved, and so anyway, being open to kind of new people in that inner circle or new investors.
Hmm.
You might go with your last investor, but like just bringing in new. Um, I think, I really appreciate all the lessons learned that a repeat entrepreneur has. The maturity, the they've experienced enough to know like best practices, etc. And so there is that kind of, I don't know, smoothness of execution. But there's going to be different challenges, right? And so they're going to have the same need for tenacity, focus, drive, not being greedy, whatever. Like, just because you've experienced one set of problems doesn't mean you won't have another set.
Well, it sounds like you're championing diversity again, bringing in out of network people to bring in fresh perspective, right? That diversity.
I think so. I mean, diversity in every way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, doesn't always happen. I mean, sometimes you just see this pattern of a VC funds a CEO or a founder, and then the company's wildly successful, and then they throw more money at that person. And a lot of those companies don't succeed. They raise too much money too fast, or I don't know. The rigor of new people on your team, new VCs, I think will drive a better outcome.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. A couple more personal questions, then we can wrap it up. What's a favorite book, podcast, or piece of content that's impacted your career, and why?
It's funny. I was having coffee with a VC I really like, and we were talking about movies and books. And he asked me if I'd read a particular book, and I looked at him and I'm like, no. And he's like, "Oh, you don't read science fiction, do you?" Because it was a particularly well known, I guess. I'm like, no, I don't. I also will confess that I don't like to read business books or nonfiction. I mean, sometimes, if a friend writes it or everyone says it's amazing, or I'll read like 20% or to get the gist of it. But honestly, I read for entertainment. I listen to podcasts for entertainment or news. I'm sure there's a million great, business or technology podcasts. And I sometimes just feel really guilty, like, well, I would be further ahead and whatever if I would just do all this other stuff. But like, honestly, when I go for a walk, I want to listen to like Smartless or Fresh Air or, maybe the New York Times, the Daily for news. Like, I'm not going to listen to, an AI talk or,
Right.
and then I consume fiction like I consume streaming content. I read like, I don't know, a book a week. I can't even remember. I like literary fiction, but I also read stuff that's more bestsellery, kind of in the same way that I would decide to watch a TV show.
Well, this is
If it's boring, I'm not going to read it.
Well, this actually goes into one of the final questions I wanted to ask about giving people just a 360-degree view of kind of who you are and what really lights you up and recharges your battery. And with so much of what you have going on in the day-to-day business world, I get why you'd want to unplug and do the comedy and do the the fiction, the literary fiction type stuff. So are there any other 2 or 3 non-obvious, more personal things about you that you're most passionate about outside of work that might surprise people?
Well, I don't know. I feel like everybody's into sports, but maybe everybody isn't. So like I feel very guilty about football because of the injuries. But I've been
watching people get hurt. Okay.
Yeah, my entire life. And my husband played football in college, and we housed Stanford football players, and they went pro. And I am super fascinated by like the strategy of football, the complexity of it. I also love the camaraderie and team elements. And my husband jokes that I like to ask about what happens in the locker room. And I feel the same way about basketball. So I watch, one season, my son and I watched every single Warriors game, which is a lot. And then he also made me watch all the other teams so that I could know all the other players.
Wow.
And I love the game as much as I love the personalities. Anyway, so people might be surprised at how much sports I watch, how many movies I watch. I don't know. I feel like I don't feel like I'm necessarily such an unusual person in my interests, but maybe relative to venture, I guess is why I started with the science fiction part of the anecdote is, I am not deeply nerdy. in that way. I'm more nerdy about the world,
Mm-hmm.
and nerdy about people, which is why, storytelling is so fascinating. By the way, I digress a little, but I know you're Mormon, right?
I was raised Mormon. I am not a practicing Mormon. No.
Okay, well, for some reason I'm just like fascinated by the Mormon
Uh
religion,
huh.
and so I've read
Yeah.
all these books. And it's the same way I'm fascinated about any group of
Yeah.
people. It's like, um, so anyway, sometimes I read about uh, different cultures, different people. I'm just like fascinated,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, no, that's trust me, having been raised, I was number 10 of 11 kids, right? So I
I
I just
remember.
I was born into a family in Salt Lake City, Utah, that my parents are still madly in love, and their life is the church, and I have total respect for the way they live their life and the values that they instilled in me. But going, maturing as an adult and questioning things and finding that my favorite topic in school was the history and philosophy of religion. That was my absolute favorite class in college. And there's so much interesting content out there on the religious background of what I grew up in. And again, I share the same fascination with what brings people together around a shared belief and how that impacts the way they live their life. And, yeah,
Yes, I
yeah,
mean, it's
it's
history,
history.
right? Like the history of it was
Yeah,
interesting to me.
yeah,
And it's also organizational behavior,
uh-huh.
or power structures,
Yes,
or love all that. Like that
yeah.
is fascinating to me.
Yeah, one of my
um,
favorite books is called The True Believer. Have you ever heard of it? It's
mhm.
about the nature of like, crowds and balance of power and things like that. So yeah, I very much share the same
Yeah.
fascination. Well, I actually want to circle back on one final thing to close this out. When I'd asked you your reasoning for wanting to be on this podcast, you'd given me a really interesting answer that kind of surprised me that I'm hoping you'll elaborate on a little bit. Do you remember what you told me?
Well, I was questioning whether I was the right person for this
Hmm.
podcast.
But you
um,
made the comment for people to feel seen.
yeah. No, I don't think I represent a large group. I think we're all a mix of being individual and other things that we are. But I don't want people to look at venture and say, okay, that's for, you know, male graduates of Stanford and MIT with the following credentials or characteristics or
Hmm.
whatever. I guess I want them to know that um, all manner of backgrounds, and people can succeed in venture if we can change access.
Hmm.
um, so, and I want them to know that I don't have a blueprint of a founder, or at least, I mean, I try to not, we all have pattern recognition,
Hmm.
um, and we're all flawed and biased and everything else.
Hmm.
But I'd like to be seen, and I think that's something that I'm finally able to do at this point in my career versus, being in my 20s and trying to be like a guy. Um, and I want them to feel seen, by kind of recognizing, who they are, what they're pursuing, how they're different, all those things.
I love it. Well, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave our listeners with in whatever way, shape, or form a concluding thought could look like?
I think, I mean, it's a cliche, but my phrase would be just do it. um, a lot of people talk about wanting to do things. And I know there's risks, but think of it like an experiment. You don't have to pursue a startup for 10 years. You can try to launch something and decide it doesn't work 6 months later, or you can take a job and decide it's not for you. I mean, you should go into it with good intentions, but um, I think that you have to err a little bit in entrepreneurship on the side of action. And so just do it is kind of my motto.
I love it. Well, I want to throw a little bit of a curveball here at the end because I'm curious. You have a lot of portfolio companies that are hiring. You are potentially going to bring on a partner next year. So if anybody out there is listening who wants to mm, plug in to the things that you're involved in, is there any special way that you could offer them a leg up in terms of the way they could approach you to be a part of anything and everything you're involved in? Something that would like help you feel like, you know what, right on the spot, you're in.
Well, for example, the office hours community, the deep tech founders, there's a link on our website where it's a very brief application. It's just being able to introduce you to the rest of the group. Really anybody can join. So I think that's very open. And I like to be pretty responsive to, legitimate inquiries on LinkedIn. I don't mean people trying to sell me something, but like, graduate students or entrepreneurs, that are relevant, right? I mean, I can't help you with consumer or whatever, but who would like a short call or who would like an opinion or a connection or, I have limits like everybody does on my time, but I try to be generous in sort of paying it forward. Those are probably just the two most obvious.
And so the best way for people to contact you would be through those two forums, right? Which I can put in the show notes.
Yeah, definitely.
Jennifer, I appreciate you taking the time. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm so glad you decided to come on. You represent so many things that matter to me. There's so much commonality between, I think, a lot of what drives us, and so I knew that would be a good alignment there. But I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope others have as well.
Well, and I really appreciate you inviting me. I think I had to be convinced that my story was relevant to everybody else. But so thank you for bringing that out.
And that's a wrap on this episode of the Bearhug Experience. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please give us a like, click, follow, or subscribe. We appreciate you taking a moment to give us a quick rating and a written review so we can continue to expand our reach and inspire the next generation of leaders to help make this world a better place. You can also contribute to the conversation around this specific episode by using the comments section at whatever platform you're on. And last but not least, if you have direct feedback, a question, or a guest you'd like to suggest that we have on the show, please shoot us an email at podcast@bearhugrecruiting.com or visit bearhugrecruiting.com/podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and we look forward to having you join us again on another episode of the Bearhug Experience.
What?